good. Okay. All right. So again, as you can see from this graph, the number of marijuana arrests per year were actually pretty steady for a good number of years. They hovered around, 10 to 20 arrests a year. But then something happened in 2012. And I'm not going to try to, give an explanation for that since I haven't studied it. But in 2012, the number began to increase quite significantly when you think of it as a percentage. In many ways, it immediately almost tripled and then increased even more dramatically. One explanation that I thought of that maybe caused this shift was the merger of the borough of Princeton and the township of Princeton. But then I looked at when that merger took effect, and it looks like it took effect in 2013. And the data began to jump in 2012. So that, it could be an explanation. Maybe the vote had happened before 2013, so maybe the reporting had changed before. But even if it does track the merger, there's another huge leap in 2015. So it could provide some context. I don't think it fully explains it, but I did want to recognize that. So then the next question that I had was, well, how does this track general New Jersey data? So I charted out this mini map over here and included it. And this is New Jersey marijuana arrests statewide. And you see that there was also a similar huge increase in 2015. So the Princeton increase actually very much mirrors the statewide increase. So my guess is that it's not due to the merger, but I wanted to also be transparent and open to that concept. What's interesting to me, when I was the executive director of the ACLU New Jersey right during this period, and I could tell you the same way that Dr. Boyer could tell you, the same way that Dr. Nathan can tell you, this is exactly the period when the conversation around marijuana legalization became much stronger. And it's almost identical to when the conversation increased about legalizing cannabis, that the number of cannabis arrests statewide, including here in Princeton, began to increase dramatically. I think that's fascinating. I'm sure there could be further analysis. This is all during the tenure of Governor Christie. But then I wanted to look at something at a different component, and that is racial disparities in marijuana arrests. And this is where the theme is actually much more consistent for Princeton. And that is, year after year, there were significant racial disparities in who actually got arrested for marijuana possession. And just to be clear, this is purely possession arrests. I didn't look at sales. I didn't look at distribution, manufacturing. This is pure possession for personal purposes, right? So it's not possession with intent to sell. This is possessing it for private consumption. That orange line at the bottom is the Black population in Princeton. And it hovers around 6%. I looked at the 2010 census data. I looked at the 2019 census data. I think in 2010, it was like 5.7%. I think in 2019, it was like 6.3, 6.4%. I averaged it out to about 6% being Princeton's Black population. On campus, I think the Black population is around 8%, maybe 9%. So it's not even that much higher. But then the blue bar is the percentage of people who were arrested in Princeton who were Black. And I want to make a point here about why am I only looking at race. The only data that is tracked by the FBI is race. Ethnicity is not tracked. I think maybe they just started tracking it in the last couple of years, but we don't have data on Latino arrests, which we know there are also significant disparities in arrests of Latino population. So please don't read anything I'm saying to somehow minimize the greater impact on communities of color, which is real. But the data that we have shows Black and white arrests. Those are the only two categories. It also shows Asian and Native American, but it has not tracked ethnicity and Latino. And by the way, for those of us who study racial justice data, when you don't track Latino data, it actually usually minimizes the Black-white disparity. because Latinos tend to be tracked as white and not as Black. So if you don't track Latino data, that means that the number of white arrests are usually higher than the actual number. So I would actually argue that if we tracked ethnic data as well, these racial disparities would be even worse. But what you see is a consistent theme that there were extreme racial disparities, with the exception of 1 year, and that was 2004. And actually the worst racial disparities were the last year that we had data for, and that is 2019, where where 63% of everyone arrested were Black. And remember, 2019 was also, towards the higher number of arrests. At the ACLU of New Jersey, we did a report that I started when I was executive director there and then ended later on, that actually looked at 14 years worth of data on the county level. And one of the findings of that report was actually that Princeton had the second worst racial disparities in all of Mercer County between the years 2000 and 2013. So even when you compare us to other county cities or municipalities around us, this is what it shows. Now, again, we could have a conversation about why these disparities. I thought it was really important just to present the data and to show kind of, how many people were arrested and what were the racial demographics. And the last point on this is I want to bring this to life, because some of you may look at this and say, well, we're only talking about 50 people a year or 70 people a year or 20 people a year. Well, each one of the, first of all, I didn't have a chance to do a calculation per capita. And I think given that Princeton is a town of about 30,000 people, having 70, 60 arrests a year for marijuana possession is actually a pretty high number given our population. But I also wanted to bring to life, well, what does a marijuana arrest mean, right? This is not just some, intellectual conversation, but there are real life consequences. And I listed some of the big consequences of what could a marijuana conviction lead to, right? It could lead up to 6 months in jail. Now, that was a rare instance during the later years of marijuana legalization, unless this was pre-bail reform, right? Because before bail reform, if you got arrested even something as minor as marijuana possession, but yet you couldn't afford your bail, you could end up spending, weeks and months in jail until you were able to bail yourself out. That became less of a problem once bail reform was passed. And again, that's thanks to the work of Dr. Boyer, the ACLU, and others. But it could also mean loss of employment, not only your current job, because you had to tell the reason you didn't show up to work that day is because you were in jail, but in terms of getting future jobs. It is still a relatively common practice, although less so, for employers to use screening applications where they ask you, have you ever been convicted of a crime? Well, if you were convicted of something as minor as marijuana possession, you have to check that box, which means that you won't get a job interview. It can mean for a driver's license suspension for up to 2 years, criminal record for 3 years, $1,200 in fines. You could lose your immigration status. When I was an immigration lawyer, I actually had clients who were put in deportation proceedings, green card holders. Under federal law, if you have 3 marijuana possession convictions, so like possessing a joint, 3 of them, it is mandatory deportation, even for a green card holder, even someone with lawful permanent residence. And as you may know, green card holder is a breath away from being a US citizen. You could lose student financial aid. Princeton University, where I teach, on their application, they ask, have you ever been convicted of a crime? It is still common practice. You could be you're banned from public housing. And there are literally thousands of collateral consequences. The ABA actually looked at the number of collateral consequences for someone living with a criminal record, and they found that there were 45,000 legal restrictions put on people with a criminal record. It's why so many of us call it the new Jim Crow. So that's the context before we move into solutions. Dr. Boyer, is there anything that I missed in terms of history that I should have said before we move to kind of what are potential solutions?
The only thing that I would add for consideration, it it may not be what has not, well, let me back up a little bit. So many of you know that one of the pieces that we've worked on also has been policing as a whole, and the use of force in policing, right? So as we're thinking about this, and we're in this, I would say we're still in this racial reckoning moment, and the George Floyd piece, but long before the George Floyd incident here in New Jersey was the force report. And the force report in New Jersey, Advanced Media did analyze, X amount of years of data of the use of force used by police officers in New Jersey. And so the state as a whole fared horribly on that metric. Princeton, for instance, while it's skewed with one of the least amounts of use of force incidents, the racial disparities are very stark in regards to who force is used against in police interaction. So in Princeton, Black folks are 493% based on population more likely to have force used against them than white people, and based on arrest, a Black person is 57% more likely to have force used. And now, while we don't know every incident, and we haven't done the look at, where was that initial call around marijuana or not, cannabis or not, I would say that the vast majority, so many police interactions being whether they traffic or cannabis arrest, that all of this plays into the conversation when we're talking about police interactions. And as you all know, whether it's cannabis, whether it's whatever, any interaction with police for Black folk is potential death. It's a traffic stop could be a life or death situation. So I just want folks to kind of think about that in regards to the arrest and all of these other pieces as well.
That's such an important context. Thank you for that. It made me think of also a couple of other things, like, one of the, and again, I don't have Princeton specific data on this, but I will tell you nationally, the concern around marijuana has always been that it's used for pretextual stop reasons. There's an infamous Supreme Court case by the name of Wren versus United States that gave the police authority to stop someone for any reason, even if it's because they were just following this person for a while and were looking for an excuse to stop them. So, it's what ends up happening is a lot of times low level infractions, like, not turning on, like driving through a stop sign, or not turning on a left turn signal, or, potentially having, baggy pants where you want to be able to frisk them. There are all these reasons for pretextual stops that have driven the enforcement of low-level offenses. There's a whole theory of policing around it called broken windows policing that actually, pushes police departments to focus on low-level offenses as a way, the theory goes, to deter greater crime. Again, I don't have Princeton-specific data to share on that, but I do think it's part of a broader conversation around policing, police practices, policing theories. The last thing I'll mention, and this is a point that the council members have made with me that I think is very much spot on. I focused on kind of racial injustices in the cannabis, enforcement context, because this is the cannabis task force. So I wanted to arm you all with data around what has cannabis enforcement looked like in Princeton over the past 25 years. But as we now enter into a justice-centric solution phase of the conversation, one that will be very much focused on racial justice, I am in no way suggesting that any of our solutions should be based solely on unfair practices when it comes to cannabis enforcement, right? There are many other histories in Princeton, whether it's around housing segregation, zoning segregation, educational segregation, other injustices that this task force can use in a positive way to justify a more reparations model of legalization. So I wanted to emphasize that point, and I know that's a point that all three of the council members who are part of this task force have said, and I completely agree with. If there are no other questions around the are there any questions around the background before we kind of take a more forward-looking approach? Okay. So now let's look at what are possible solutions. And this is where I divided it into 4 categories. The first one has to do with, how can we make future enforcement more equitable, recognizing the inequities of past enforcement? Now, the context for this is, there are still things that are going to continue being illegal, even now when cannabis possession for private use is no longer illegal. So what can we do as the municipality of Princeton to try to minimize the unnecessary harm that could be caused by a continuation of the war on marijuana and the broader war on drugs? So these are some of the suggestions that we came up with. First of all, and I'll talk about the legal context for this at the end. So let me say what I think we should do, and then we could talk about the legal boundaries. First of all, we recommend that Princeton deprioritizes drug possession arrests. And this includes all types of drugs, not just cannabis, although of course cannabis. This is something that the state of Oregon recently did, and it passed it through a ballot initiative to decriminalize drug possession. This is something that I know Dr. Boyer is working on to try to get the state of New Jersey to do. But while that conversation is happening, a municipality has the authority, a police department have the authority to use their discretion to deprioritize certain arrests. So we recommend that this task force come out with a recommendation that says the municipality of Princeton should deprioritize drug possession arrests. This includes cannabis arrests. And I would also include the home grow prohibition. As far as I know, New Jersey is the only state, I think, certainly through the legislative process, that legalized possession of cannabis, but made it illegal for you to grow this plant at home. It's very weird. There's a ton of inequity built into it, in the sense of someone can't use this, medicine or this, pleasure by just growing it in their backyard. They have to pay someone to purchase it. Obviously, there's like economic justice issues associated with it. I would say that the municipality should say, we can't do anything to change state law, but we could say, what are we going to use our resources for? And we don't think that our resources should be spent on enforcing the home grow prohibition. And I'll talk about the legal context of this in a second, so just give me a second. Another thing is, there are going to be employers now, here in Princeton that are going to be in positions of, do we drug test, our employees? There's going to be a lot of pressure on businesses because there's going to be a bit of a, uncertainty, I think, as the law takes effect. Our recommendation is that we come out with a statement and say, or maybe even a law, see if it's possible, I'll talk about that in a second, that there shouldn't be any suspicionless drug testing happening by employers in Princeton. If there's an individualized reason to think that someone, came to work high, then obviously there could be legal grounds for that. But the practice of, suspicionless drug testing is something that we should frown upon in the Princeton municipality. This is complicated legally because we are a municipality and you are the legislative body, so there's only so much that you can do. I will say that there are many, many precedents for Princeton and for other municipalities to issue a statement of values that say, here's what we believe. I understand that the council cannot dictate the police department for how it does its job. Totally understand that. I'm not pushing for that. But the council can come out with its statement of values and sentiments, whether maybe in the form of a resolution. And there's precedent, during the early years of the marijuana legalization movement, we were constantly pushing for municipalities to come out and tell their police departments or to ask their police departments not to prioritize marijuana arrests. There were police chiefs all around the country who said, I'm going to use my discretionary power as a police chief to issue a directive to my line officers to say, do not make it a lowest enforcement priority. There's precedent for that. It's been done. I would encourage the council and this task force to recommend that. It's using our discretionary authority in the same way that there are district attorneys now across the country, like Larry Krasner in Philadelphia, who's using his prosecutorial discretion to say that he's not going to focus on prosecuting certain things. But I also understand that this is a complicated area of law and we'll have to work within, a very delicate balance here. So those are some suggestions for equity in enforcement. Anything I missed there, Dr. Boyer, that we discussed?
No, I think, I think that about gets it. The one piece that we may want to consider too, that Udi, you and I did not discuss, but comes to mind also, is how these kind of positive drug tests even enforce things like child welfare and services, and how this can impact mothers who and we see a lot of data nationally, and there's some data around this in New Jersey. This is something we'll be working on in the future to do a deeper dive on. But we have seen how Black mothers, for instance, are targeted for this kind of testing and things, and then it adversely affects, and then children are taken from mothers as a result. So these are all things that have to be considered, because the tentacles of the drug war really go in so many different places, and all of these things have not thoroughly been worked out in the law. So how that works itself out, particularly here in Princeton, and how Princeton can guard against some of these things, I think has to be considered.
That is such a great point. I should have made that point. And it's making me think that maybe the way this could look is maybe we come out with a resolution, we draft a resolution, and the whole framing for it is putting, this all in the context of a public health frame rather than a criminal justice frame, right? And talking about drugs and controlled substances and the need for all tentacles of Princeton to treat this issue as a public health issue rather than a criminal justice one. And whether it's when it comes to law enforcement or whether it's to child welfare services, our schools, for example, not minimizing the harm that serious addiction could cause, but stating that we must approach this from a public health approach and not from a law enforcement approach. Any questions on in enforcement before we move on to the next category, which will be equity in the industry? Okay, so let's move on to the next slide, and that's equity in the cannabis industry. This is something that's been getting a lot of attention statewide. A lot of the statewide civil rights advocates are focusing on this. And the basic framing is very simple and very compelling, right? And that is, the war on marijuana was way disproportionately a war on communities of color. We looked at the data here in Princeton. The last year for which we have data, 63% of all arrests for marijuana in Princeton were of Black people, even though this is a town of 6% Black people. So this has been a war on communities of color in many ways. But now, who's going to profit from the legalization of cannabis? And there's a serious concern that it's white people and wealthy white people and wealth and large companies who have the resources and the bandwidth that are going to profit the most from this. And that is just an inherent injustice in it. So that has been also a guide for the state regulations. And I know it's been a big conversation. I know it's something Governor Murphy cares deeply about. So the question is, what can we in Princeton do to help reduce the barriers to entry into the industry for communities of color and people living with a criminal record? Again, we're legally constrained here, and I'll talk about that at the end. And our council, municipal council, has been really helpful with helping us understand what we cannot or cannot do. But in the ideal world, and maybe we could wiggle our way around it, we recommend a few things that we do. First of all, to affirmatively state when we release, when we opt in and say we welcome businesses, to affirmatively state that we seek in particular applicants who have passed convictions for drugs, controlled substance convictions, and who come from communities targeted by the war on drugs. Now, there's a lot of ways to define this. I know that the ACLU of New Jersey actually recently came out with a document that helps define, what does this specifically mean? And we can engage in conversation about that, but issue that statement as part of it and make as much effort as possible to encourage people with past convictions and who come from communities targeted by the war on drugs to apply. Secondly, bar Princeton from discriminating against people with past criminal convictions. I don't know what the process is right now, so I don't want to suggest that we are discriminating or we will discriminate. And maybe once I get more information, I'll learn more. I wasn't able to research this in time. But I know that historically, right, and some of this maybe is controlled by state regulations, there are a lot of disqualifiers for people who are trying to get a business license. And I know when the CRC came out with its regulations, it also emphasized this point that municipalities should make a good faith effort to try to hire people with marijuana convictions. I think we should do everything we can, again, to ensure that it's not used as a screener, both for licenses for people to own marijuana businesses, but then that employment applications used by these businesses do not themselves filter out people with past criminal convictions by including a box, as we've already talked about, and so forth. Third, and I realize this one is tough, I realize there's only a limited pool of money we're dealing with, but I think in the ideal world, we would also try to provide some assistance to applicants who come from historically targeted communities that because of that history may not have as much access to capital. Maybe we can make loans available, not free money, but loans with minimal interest rates, or help with some fees. Although the CRC did come out with its recommended fees, and they were lower than other states, and that's a really good thing. Obviously, this becomes even more complicated since we're still dealing with a regime where under federal law, cannabis is still illegal. So a lot of banks are not, banks are in a bind about how much can they offer capital for businesses, or loans for businesses to start up. And for that reason, really the big players in the cannabis industry right now are ones that have their own capital, right? That don't need to rely on loans, that can use their existing resources. And it just creates a self-perpetuating cycle where people with money are going to make more money. And the question is, what can we do to allow new entry points for startup businesses, for small businesses, for people who come from Trenton, who want to start a business in Princeton, and what can we do? Another idea, and this was Dr. Boer's idea, which I loved, so I want to make sure to give him credit for it, was, let's say we don't get any, maybe we get, mostly white-owned businesses here in Princeton. Maybe we get businesses that are, controlled by, bigger companies that had the capital. do everything we can to prod them to start their own justice fund, for them to make a contribution to a community reinvestment fund, which I'll talk about in a second, that will share some of their profits with the communities that we're trying to support. These are just some ideas. Again, I understand we have legal constraints. One of the biggest ones that our council has been very clear about is that we're legally prohibited from using these factors as a way to choose if we get fewer applicants than the number of licenses that we have, right? So for example, if we only have 5 licenses available, but we get 3 applicants, we need to take those 3 applicants legally, and we cannot. That's what we've been informed. Totally get it. I have no reason to doubt that. But if we get 8 applicants for 5 licenses, that's when we can start using factors. Now, we need to make sure that we're transparent about them. We need to make sure that we're metric driven as much as possible, that we're very clear with the factor. So there is still a science to it. But my understanding is if there are more applicants and there are licensing availability, we can use various factors to make those difficult decisions. And this is where we can have our values guide us and make it as much about, creating more equity in the industry as possible. Is there anything that I missed?
Yeah, you did.
Okay.
You maybe should have talked a little bit about the fact that when you're talking about equity in the cannabis industry, you should probably tie it to a conversation around equity in the cannabis industry related to community thoughts, community vision, and how community participates in that process. I mean, you say here, I guess bullet number 3, bar Princeton from discriminating against license applications. Well, any of us who are reading the CRC rules sees that that's there, very pronounced, and very obvious. Providing assistance with the fees and the startup loans, that's a different piece. And I think part of trying to provide information about who is doing access to capital, if in fact the town can't do that, is a very important piece. And then ask the cannabis businesses to support the Justice Fund, not just the Justice Fund. If you look at best practices relative to how revenue is distributed in states and municipalities around the country, they're looking at schools, they're looking at housing. In New Jersey specifically, 30% of the revenue that comes from cannabis sales will go towards police. So there are multiple issues tied into the legal constraints issue that you raise here, as well as equity in the cannabis industry. And so I think that part of what we have to do is engage in the industry is to engage them along the lines of truth, transparency, and trust. Because if we can't get those pieces in place, some of the other stuff that you're talking about may or may not happen. And I'm not speaking from somebody new in the industry, being in Colorado after 10 years almost, 2.2 last year, and Denver revenue. Then we have some best practices, but we also have some gaps and holes that have not come about, and social equity is one of them. And so a bunch of us are trying to push this conversation, which is why I appreciate Charles mentioning up front some of the stuff that we're doing nationally, because he's a part of that discussion. Because what we see is nationally and then statewide and then locally is that we're still in the weeds. There's still a lot of smoke out here, pun intended. And so part of what needs to happen, I think, dealing with equity in the cannabis industry is to take into consideration historically what we have learned from hotel, what we've learned from alcohol, what we've learned from newspaper, what we've learned from other areas, and then how they are applicable into the situation. And what you find out is that the only consistent tool that you can use in this environment to hold the cannabis industry accountable is a report card. And a report card then deals with ownership, C-suite, staff, contributions, media placement, ancillary businesses. all those types of things that go with holding the industry accountable without necessarily always making it legislation that drives the conversation.
Yeah. I agree with everything that you said, and it's actually a perfect setup for the next two slides, which are all about what to do with the revenue and how do you create accountability. So thank you. And I 100% agree. So the third category I want to talk about is what do we do with the tax that we have control over, right? There's the state tax, which Mr. Bailey talked about, that there are already ideas on what will the state do with it, which we don't have control over, but we do have control over what do we do with the 2% municipal tax that Princeton can levy. And this is where, we want to argue that this should be, and I think there's alignment here, so I'm not suggesting it's just us, that this 2% tax should be used to reinvest in communities, again, historically targeted by the war on drugs. Don't tie us to the name, but something that we could create is a Princeton Community Reinvestment Justice Fund. And again, I'm not sticking with the name, it's just a suggestion. But more importantly, there's a ton and there's a huge range. And we're going to have to go through a very deliberate process that includes community engagement. And that's incredibly important. I know that's beginning tonight in many ways, but it's going to go on for a while. There are so many different things that we can use that tax revenue to invest in. We could focus specifically on the intersection of criminal justice and cannabis enforcement and the collateral consequences, provide reentry services, which some of this stuff that Princeton already does, job training, criminal record expungement, and any other things that we could do to help Princeton residents who are still living with a criminal record. But then there are other models that are starting to pop up across the nation that I think should really be looked at by Princeton. And I know some of these we've already discussed a few times on the task force. So the one that has gotten the most attention is the Evanston model. And we shared a podcast, I think at the last meeting or 2 meetings ago, that actually is a really detailed account of how Evanston came to its conclusion. But Evanston actually adopted what they're calling a mini reparations model. And Evanston, Illinois, right? Relatively small town, although I think larger than Princeton, but not a big city. They're using their marijuana tax revenue in the state of Illinois to provide Black residents with housing assistance and economic development benefits. So if you're someone who's like, I don't remember what criteria they use, but you had to show that. Sorry, there's some background noise. But you have to show that you have some sort of like history in Evanston. And if you do, they're actually helping you potentially with mortgage payments and with other housing assistance. There's also other economic development benefits. And this is using tax revenue. This is specifically for Black residents in the city. There's the Amherst, Massachusetts model, which is using marijuana tax as just one revenue stream to implement reparations to Black residents. Now, as far as I can tell, they haven't fully defined yet what those reparations are going to look like, but they are calling it a reparations fund. And by the way, I'm torn about using that term because when I think of reparations, it's a lot more than what a 2% tax can afford. We're talking about billions of dollars that need to be. But for sake of just this conversation, I'm using that term. And it's also how Amherst and Evanston are describing what they are doing. Then there's the Rochester model, which is being discussed as we speak. I think there's another town hall in Rochester like this week, or maybe it was last week, where they actually want to implement a universal basic income for Black residents to try to narrow the white-Black wealth gap in the city of Rochester. Now, I understand that the city of Rochester is much bigger than the municipality of Princeton. We are talking about a much smaller fund, so we need to be more purposeful. But the point is that cities, towns are starting to be very, very creative with how they're using their funding, but there is really one goal, and that is to focus on investing those funds in Black communities and communities of color in that town to help them, to help bridge really the Black white wealth gap that has been created by a decades-long war on drugs. So whether that looks like helping someone own a house, which is, we all know, is one of the greatest ways to rise economically in America. And in a place like Princeton, where housing is so expensive, that is obviously a key factor, or other economic development needs. I want to be blunt about this part, and maybe it will be controversial. I don't think it will be, but I think it's really important that we do not use any of that 2% revenue stream to fund law enforcement entities and services. I think there's alignment there. I'm pretty positive. I know I'm not going to speak for anyone, but I think there's alignment there. And I heard Mr. Bailey mention as part of the state law, and I know there's a lot of resentment that some of that is using for law enforcement. I don't think we should do that under 2% with our 2% tax. And then the final point, I think also Mr. Bailey mentioned, is that, I don't think this is us for only to determine. I think this is where we have to be very deliberate, go through a community engagement process. My guess is we're not going to find consensus here. There's going to be a lot of different, streams of thoughts. But maybe at the very least, we could start providing a menu of options. Maybe we could go through that first filter, provide a menu of options for community engagement, and then receive feedback. And maybe we'll end up missing one option entirely, or maybe we give 3 to 4 options and see whether there's at least more consensus on one of them. But the concept here is clear, and that is use the 2% municipal tax to invest in whatever way we decide in communities of color that have been historically targeted by the war on drugs.
What do you do, Udi, in your perspective, what do you do in a community like Princeton that only has about 4 streets that could be perceived as a community historically targeted by the war on drugs, number one. Number two, everything up here is good. I think you ought to increase the range of potential investments to look at best practices from around the country, which you started to with at least 3 cities here. But I think around the country, there are a number of them. Example, in California, just recently, they've merged all the 3 entities responsible for marijuana management, for rules, into one, so they can streamline everything, because there's been so much confusion around what's going on in the state that it's become very important for them to streamline the process so that they could do one-stop shopping, even though there are multiplicity of issues that need to be addressed. And then the other thing I just wanted to mention here, what we have done in Colorado is to put something together called a good faith agreement. And this good neighbors agreement allows then, wherever you find yourself, and Princeton is an exception, if we were in Trenton, it might be in the East Ward, or it might be in the North Ward, or where Reverend Boyer's church is. A dispensary who would open up in that area would then have to go to Reverend Boyer, go to some of the community organizations in that area, and talk about what they're going to do and be as a good neighbor. They're going to hire folks, they're going to invest in the community. There's going to be noise complaints, there's going to be graffiti issues, there's going to be community meetings that we want your staff to come participate in. That community engagement process needs to be thorough and efficient, but highly visible, because I think that's how you recognize and recommend somebody for continuous support because of the work they're doing in the community. And I think that's a big, important piece as part of the engagement process.
Yeah, Udi, if I jump in here a little bit, because I mean, John is the godfather of all of this, and so I certainly concur and underline everything he's saying. Well, I think there's a couple of pieces here, because Princeton is very unique, right? In Trenton, the pathway is very clear. I mean, all things being considered, right? So for instance, we have some entities coming in here in Trenton, and we are in the process of developing community benefit agreements, right? Similar to what's done when you know, and they haven't always been done very successfully.
That's right.
You know, in regards to economic development and developers coming in, there are some more successful models than others. We're actually working to organize some things like that. But in a place like Princeton, where the population is overwhelmingly white, overwhelmingly prosperous, the question, the framing, back to some of my original comments that I think need to be considered is, what are the barriers that make us where we are, right? So to John's point, you got 4 streets. You can't undo all the damage that has been done just on those 4 streets. And I almost guarantee that the vast majority of the folks that you have arrested as a township or that you have charged have been from Trenton and the surrounding areas. And so the question is that how do you reinvest in the people that you divested from because they drove through Princeton? So there's a couple of pieces. One, how do you make housing stock available to begin to break down the massive segregation that is Princeton, right? So thinking specifically about housing, why housing is raised up here in that kind of space. 2, something that occurred to me that I wish I would have thought of when we were talking earlier, but it really hit me when you started the presentation, Udi. It hit me in a different way looking at the charts. Is that Princeton knows exactly who was arrested, who was charged, what fines were charged, and the whole 9 over the course of those years. Reparations is the perfect word because you need to pay all of those folks back for everything that they were charged with interest. That's something you can direct payback for disproportionately divesting from, taking wealth. This is something that I think should be one of the main #1 priorities of Princeton, is to find those folks from those years who were targeted and send them a check. And you can calculate it. You know what they were fined, you know what the court costs were. You literally just pay folks back. That's one piece that I think must be one of the #1 priorities in regards to a town like Princeton, where you can calculate that and you can identify those people directly. So those are some of the pieces that I would add here and that I think are critical, and some of the ways that really need to be thought through, particularly in a place like Princeton, where the dynamics are much different than they are in a Trenton, a Camden, or a North.
Well, you know, good brother Charles, you raise a very good point, because let's just broaden it a little bit. Udi and Eve and at least the council people, you know that the university gives X number of dollars, gave X number of dollars for affordable housing activity in the Witherspoon-Jackson area. And so to a great degree, that's putting something back. The university recognized that there had been a disparity in that process. And so now we have an opportunity to do something different here. And if we look at it, where are the majority of the folks who lived in the John Witherspoon area? Where are they now? They're at the Village, they're at Reading Circle, they're at the Holly House, or if they're seniors, they're at Elm Court or somewhere else. But they have moved out of that area. And now we're talking about a way of being able to do something that may allow either historical folks who had to leave that area because of tax reasons, maybe to be able to be brought back into that community, because now with some type of support, they can get a first-time loan from a fund somewhere in the town that may allow them to purchase a home or get back into the community. And in fact, with Princeton dealing with affordable housing count, trying to meet that, there's a definite need to mix the cannabis revenue, the housing benefits, and the other types of services, including the public safety piece that Brother Boyer just mentioned, relative to how we go about trying to regroup, recalibrate, and reach back and identify some of those folks who have been adversely impacted by the war, even from those 4 or 5 streets.
That's exactly right. I mean, I was going to say the same thing. Well, look, I think there's plenty that we could do in those 4 blocks, and considering that we're not going to have a huge pot of money. I mean, we're expecting what revenue stream to be at least 100,000, but potentially more. I mean, those are the estimates.
I think we've been told 200 to 400K per dispensary, or if we
per dispensary.
so it could add up to a lot depending on what gets located here.
Okay, that's more than I thought. That's great. But I think we first focus, on the communities that do live here, and then we make Princeton much more hospitable for Black people and other communities of color to move in and create roots here and create generational wealth. I love the idea of also going back through the roles of the hundreds of people who were arrested over those 25 years. I think I did the calculation. It was something like 585 or something. Do our due diligence and trying to get into contact with them. I think, once there's alignment on the goal, the creativity will begin flowing in terms of all the different things. And then we'll have to actually go through a process on what to focus on.
Don't be naive, Udi, don't be naive. All right, I'm just gonna say to you, don't be naive. What we have seen, Brother Boy and myself, is that in every state and in every municipality, there are great ideas and great suggestions, but people are giving lip service to our historical misery as African Americans in this country. And so we just can't sit back. I mean, we can tell y'all, we can make you aware, but if the access and the opportunity is not there, then this is going to be a contentious conversation, because the Black community is not going to back up. The Black elected officials are not going to back up. And in cases, Black advocates who see the rights and the wrongs or the pause that is taking place are going to speak up, because there's a need to be more and do more in this conversation.
Yep, that is something we face every day. I agree. So let's talk about the last component, and that is the need to actually supervise everything that's happening and to make sure that we're meeting the goals that we set out for ourselves. So this is where it should be in the form of legislation that we pass that will require data collection, that will track justice and equity in both enforcement and in the industry. So we can pass legislation that authorizes collection and requires the public reporting of everything from who are the applicants and the like, we don't need to divulge personally identifiable information, but what we care about is race, ethnicity, age, sex, veteran status, other things. But who are the applicants, who are the licensees that we actually give out, who are the employees, who are they hiring? Similarly, with our enforcement practices, we track some of this data already as Princeton. I don't know if we track all of it. But who is cited, who is arrested, who is convicted for the marijuana law violations that will continue, since there are still things that are illegal. I would broaden this also to like general drug law enforcement, but also all other. I mean, there's a whole list of data points that we could come up with that looks at how is this being enforced on the street, in the homes, and in the workforce. Require for it to be publicly reported twice a year. I think we already have that portal that I think maybe isn't a monthly requirement, but maybe also doing some sort of analysis. And this is going to create transparency. And this is where we'll be on the onus will be on the media, on civil rights advocates, on this task force if it continues to exist, to make sure that whatever way this is implemented aligns with the values that we stated. Because if we just allow it to kind of implement itself, it's not going to go the right way. We have plenty of examples of that. And in my work, I've been working on these issues for about 20 years. One of the big campaigns I ran like 15 years ago was around stop and frisk in New York City. And it wasn't until we were able to get quarterly data from the NYPD to make the case that it continues to be Black and brown people who are targeted by the police, and to hammer that point home, quarter after quarter after quarter, we were finally able to see some more substantial reforms. But even with that, it's not as if that inequity still doesn't persist. But this is where I don't minimize the value of data. It helps, to push the narrative of inequity that then helps us find solutions. So I'm going to stop the screen share now. I can't remember if this task force ends at 3 or 3:30.
We officially end at 3.
Okay.
You
I
know,
did wanted to leave like 15 minutes for conversation, and we're at exactly 2:45. So I just talked a ton. I don't mean to suck up a lot of oxygen, but I would love, to hear just any impressions, things people agree with, disagree with. I saw some chatter in the chat box, but I'll just open it up now.
Colleen, you need to unmute. Colleen, you're still, oh, you good. Got it.
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Udi. Thank you so much, Dr. Boyer and Mr. Bailey, for being here today. It's been, thank you for your time and wisdom and insight. And I think in the interest of time, I personally have some things that I wanted to share, questions, comments, suggestions, and we are nearly out of time. And so this is the beginning of a long dialogue. What might we do in order to continue this dialogue, either offline or through forming a committee to move forward with this? I mean, Udi, I don't know whether that's part of our ongoing target, but I did have some things I wanted to share, and I'm sure other folks do too. And I think we had a lot of good information presented here, but not enough time for conversation. That's what I think.
Yeah, the way this has been presented to me by the council members is that this is purely the beginning, and this is the first of many, many more conversations by this task force.
Right.
I just want to say real quick that we've had so many conversations in this group where people have said, when are we going to get a chance to talk about these issues, which are so important to us? And because of this deadline, which we ended up missing anyway, but we were really sort of focused on doing what we needed to do to meet that deadline. And even though we missed that deadline, there is a strong consensus on the task force to get the opt-in rules passed. So we are going to continue to focus on that, hopefully not to the exclusion of other things. And once that initial step is passed, then, the social and racial justice and, the education components, which have kind of taken a backseat, will really become front and center. And although this is a task force, not a standing committee, depending on everybody's availability and interest and the need, we may very well be continuing on, beyond this year. I mean, I don't want to break it to anyone like that, but, I see this really as a very important continuing conversation. It's not going to be settled in a couple of months.
So would it be appropriate to ask if we could set up a Google document as we have done in the past, where folks could share conversation, dialogue, suggestions, or is that premature?
Yeah, I think that's a lovely idea. And Udi, I know there was one major point in terms of the effect of a cannabis conviction that Dr. Boyer spoke about, particularly on mothers and, parental rights and everything. I'd love to see that added to the list of penalties. And maybe there were other points as well that I missed, but if you could both email that to our entire group, as well as maybe, start a Google document and give people, edit access, and people can add thoughts and ideas. And I think that's worked well. Colleen, thank you for that suggestion.
And I guess, of course, we'll add Dr. Boyer and Mr. Bailey, or is that, if we have things to address to them, how can we do that after this meeting?
Well, number one, I put in my email to everybody, number one. And number two, Dr. Boyer and I are on a panel together tomorrow dealing with a similar conversation on Trenton. And then Colleen, is there something specific that you want or that you want to talk about? Because one of the things that I do in our discussions is if somebody raises a questions and they're not sure, then the first thing that I do is come right at them, and that is there something specific that you need or you want to talk about that you're unclear about that Dr. Boyer, myself, or even others on this committee, David Nathan and others, can be of help with?
Well, there is one opportunity that I wanted to share about an organization that is in its infancy, that was born at my church, which is the Presbyterian Church of Lawrenceville, PCOL. And it's a program called Work Well, and it's going to be Trenton-based. And the idea is to have job training for previously incarcerated folks. And I just thought that, it would be a good place for some of the Trenton tax revenue to go toward helping, get employment for folks who were previously incarcerated. And my church has worked hand in hand with Daryl Armstrong and sometimes Reverend Atkinson. I don't know if you know those folks, but I just think I just think it's an opportunity worth pursuing. And I know that they were going to the town of Lawrenceville today to ask for funding from the tax revenue, although they are going to be ultimately Trenton based. So that was one thing I had wanted to share. It's the Work Well program, and I'd love to send you information about it. I think it's destined for success. And
Thank you. John no longer lives in Princeton, but grew up here and has very deep roots and comes back periodically. And he's been really good at including all of us. And I think I passed John's email about the event tomorrow, which unfortunately I can't attend, but I hope at least one of the council members will be there, where Reverend Boyer will also be in attendance. And John does these regularly, and they're a great opportunity to learn and hear from other people who he knows and has brought into the conversation. So I definitely encourage anyone who's available tomorrow. John, is it at 3?
At 3 p.m.
Yeah.
But Reverend Boyer, who is doing the Lord's work, won't be there until 4 p.m. And so I just wanted to make sure, but he's going to be in a conversation with other Trenton community leaders, talking about social equity, talking about access to capital, talking about navigation, all of those types of things that you folks are talking about here, which is one of the reasons I wanted to be here. But two, also one of the reasons I wanted to applaud the work of Michelle and Letitia and Eve and Udi, because these are important conversations. And Colleen, we're 10 years in and we're still having this conversation. So the conversation is going to continue to be there. And no question is either a dumb question. Every question is relative, because we're going to continue to ask as many questions as we can. And using the theme from John McPhee's book, A Sense of Where You Are, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to get a sense of where we are and how everybody can be involved in this process, because we didn't get here overnight. And so we're not going to resolve the issues overnight.
thank you.
Well, one thing that I hope to do, Udi, with your PowerPoint is just run it by our attorney. I think some of the things I know, like I've been working on this sustainable landscaping initiative, and our original thought was to use fees generated if somebody got a summons for using a gas leaf blower at the wrong time of day or out of season, that we would take that money and we would target it to help landscapers with the transition or with education. So that is so much more complicated than it seemed when that was actually an idea that came from the landscapers. I thought it was great. We can't do that. So some of the things that you're suggesting, I'm sure our attorney, and I may not even be right about some of the things that I think are going to be problematic. Some of those she'll go, oh yeah, that's fine, but you can't do that. So that's something I want to do soon, so we can get a sense of, okay, which things can we pursue, or maybe is there another way to pursue that goal, but a different way? So that I'll make sure that we do that and add that to the conversation. Leticia, please.
Yes, something that came up in the conversation, and it really caught my attention, because in the data that we received from the police on a regular basis, and when we have questioned the racial disparity of arrest, compared to our population, we have often heard from our chief that many of those that the disparity is not a true, it doesn't demonstrate as far as for what our population is, because of what was said earlier, that many of those are people who are driving through, individuals who are driving through. So they're not from Princeton, those that are being cited or arrested. So and one suggestion that was made is, how do we address that? How do we address those that have been impacted by that? if they're not from Princeton. And so that's something that I really, if Udi, if it can be part of the presentation or part of the conversation, I would really like for that to be part of it.
Yeah, and I'm really glad that you raised that. And that's one of the pieces that I'm particularly passionate about, and one of the reasons why I make the suggestion to directly compensate folks. Just a personal story, right? My own person. I grew up in Plainfield, New Jersey, and as a young person, as a young person in New Jersey, and I lived on the border of Scotch Plains. So literally, I have friends in Scotch Plains. I would walk across the street, walk across Terrell Road. I was never once stopped or had any police interaction all the years that I grew up in Plainfield, never with Plainfield police.
Yeah.
All of my record, my arrest, fines, everything were from Scotch Plains, Westfield, Cranford, Mountainside, and Summit. All of the majority white towns, because they knew I wasn't supposed to be there. For the police chief to admit that, it admits that there is targeted enforcement for folks who you don't look like you should be here.
I just have to, I'm not disputing that may very well be the case, but a number of years ago, I think in 2016 or 17, a group from Rutgers came in from I can't remember the name, some police institute or study center there. And they did a study with the police department in which they looked at data, and they looked at daytime stops versus nighttime stops. And I went along early on when I got onto council, I went along for a ride with the police officer, which technically is open to anybody. I don't know if they're doing it now because of COVID, but it was very educational. And so at night, you really can't see who is driving. I mean, at least I could not, being in the front seat of the car. And the police data did reveal that actually there, as a percentage, there were fewer people of color stopped during the day when they could see the race, ethnicity of the person driving than at night. So to me, and I could be wrong, to me, I read that as the police are aware of that and they are trying when they can to compensate, and that those numbers were very clear, though the reasoning obviously is not true. And I would love to have this study done again, because I'd really be curious. So, it could be things that, more subtle things like the make and model of a car, right? This car doesn't look like it belongs in Princeton. It's beat up or whatever. So just to say that, I'm not saying that that's not part of it, but there are other elements I think that are part of that, rather than just driving while black, which could be part of it. But I think there are other elements that, more socioeconomic elements as well that affect what the police do.
Yeah. Don't downplay what Reverend Boyer is saying, because driving while black, not only in New Jersey, up and down Route 1, up and down 27, are significant issues still. And you go back to a state police report that deals with the fact that blacks between Edison and, between 13 and 9 on the turnpike was routinely stopped because they had cars that looked like they didn't belong to the individuals who were driving them, but at the same time, the individuals who were driving them were African American.
Yes, absolutely. I understand that. Thank you.
And sorry, I just wanted to add to that, and this has nothing to do with driving and citations, but how it has impacted our families who live in public housing. I recall years ago, and it has really stuck with me, years ago, and someone came to Human Services claiming discrimination because back when they were a teenager, they have been caught with, they were, I don't know that they were actually cited, but they have been caught, and the family was made to forced to decide whether they were going to be evicted or send their child to live with a grandparent. And so they sent the child to live with the grandparent. Now, years later, apparently this person was still being prevented from living in public housing because of past incidents. And I know that we, early on we asked, how is this, because this is still federally, it's not legalized, how is it going to impact our families who live in public housing? And I think we were assured that it wouldn't. Do I remember that correctly?
I don't think if the public housing has any federal involvement, I think that no, I mean, if
I think
somebody
it continues, and this is one of the remnants.
Yeah.
When President Biden was Senator Biden, this is one of his legacies, and we're pushing President Biden to try to undo Senator Biden's, criminal laws. Can I add one thing to the conversation that we just had? First, express like how much I agree with what Reverend Dr. Boyer said, but then also play it out a bit more. Eva, I appreciated what you said about the stop, but we're not talking here about vehicle stops. We're talking here about marijuana possession arrests. And there's so many additional steps that happen, even if for the sake of argument, let's say it was a race neutral stop. Let's say for the sake of the argument, for it to then lead to a marijuana arrest, there are so many discretionary points
absolutely
in that process of, well, if it was a marijuana possession arrest within a car, what led to that car to be searched? What led to that person to be patted down where they found the joint in their pocket? There's just like, we could play out a scenario that is a real world scenario that there's constant discretion that comes to play about whether you just say, oh man, these are a bunch of college students, they're just being silly, or whether it's like, no, I'm going to use the full force of the law here
I cannot agree with you more on that.
Yeah, and just as to point out the obvious, what I'm sure does not happen during a ride along at night is what actually happens when police follow cars. So every time the spotlight is shined, so they can see who is in the car, that's what happens at night, which I'm sure does not happen during a ride along with a council member.
I understand that. I'm not totally naive. I'm only somewhat naive. So I don't mean at all to say that. I just meant to say that it was an interesting experience. I don't think I've ever had, I was in the car for 4 or 5 hours. It was a really interesting experience. And in fact, that we did stop someone who was an Uber driver who turned out to be a Black woman. And that led me to seize a advantage of that opportunity to talk to the officer about traffic stops, about, the black-white, gap and how he handled that. It was an interesting conversation, even though I know who I am and that I'm not, the audience on whom, the wrath of the police falls generally. So I understand all of that and respect it. I just wanted to say that I think Udi's point is right. It's not the original stop, maybe, but it's what happens after that.
Can I raise a question here? Because I'd really be interested. I see my good friend Kristen Alpert on this call. And so I'd be really interested in knowing what the university's position is relative to cannabis. Because one of the things that I mentioned earlier, the university gave dollars for housing in the Witherspoon-Jackson community. Around the country right now, including the University of Mississippi and other colleges, higher education, there are courses that are being developed around cannabis. Has the university started thinking about anything in terms of courses, or is there an opportunity from your perspective that the university might consider putting some money into the cannabis industry here as a loan or a fee support piece?
John, thank you. Good to see you. I think I've said this in one of the early meetings of this group when I was asked a question about university position about cannabis. I think from the beginning point, we have to remember, John, we receive a lot of federal funding at the university, and there's a lot of still conflict between the state laws and the federal laws. that I would say I'm not a lawyer, that our lawyers are still sorting out. So I don't think we can make any commitments because quite simply, it's very complicated for us right now, John. And a lot of people are thinking about this, and we're just happy, the institution specifically asked me, and I have appreciated being part of these conversations, and I appreciate having the university involved. It's been a really enlightening conversation. I think, John, thank you for asking the question. I can't give a more firm answer other than complicated due to conflict between federal and state laws that lawyers are trying to figure out.
Okay,
And
thanks.
one of the things Kristen mentioned to us is that anything that's owned, like when we were talking about where a cannabis dispensary or retail or any element of the business might go, is that it cannot go on anything. Like the university has property along Alexander Road, which from some perspective is a great place, but mostly it's owned by the university and they cannot be involved because of the nature of the, oh, am I wrong about that?
I guess I wouldn't say that, Eva. I think what I was pointing out is that when we were talking about locations, I was trying to point out that that it's not obvious to the external eye that many of those buildings are already occupied by university use. So don't think that it's a business that would, or a spot that would naturally open up. I don't believe we have firm guidance yet on whether or not, to the extent that we are a commercial landlord, which we are in town, we do, compared to our peer institutions, we do have a very low square footage percentage in the community. I think it's less than 200,000 square feet of, and I'll give you an example. The buildings where Thomas Sweet is located, the university owns. The Garden Theater is owned by the university. So we are a modest commercial property owner. And just to be clear, I don't think we have firm guidance on whether or not that prohibits.
Then thank you for clarifying. Yeah.
So Eve, one other additional quick question. One of the things that we're dealing with is location issues, right? And as I read some information about today's meeting, it talked about Witherspoon Street, it talked about the shopping center, it talked about several other locations. One of the things that we've tried to do specifically is to, when we bring new people into the industry, is to try to make sure there's no duplication, another dispensary in close proximity. But in addition to that, we try to make sure that we do not put someone in the warehouse district when there's an opportunity to be in a residential. And I see that based on where you're going, because Kristen, you and I both know Hoagie Haven is an indicator of what a weed shop will look like in Princeton. There will be folks going in and out of there, and there's going to be university students who are going to be spending an inordinate amount of money buying weed to get through their junior papers and their senior thesis and any test that they'll have to take. And so I'm just wondering, has any consideration been given to a license that would allow, or a license that would be in close proximity to the university, which will be a hotspot and potentially a successful entity because of the amount of traffic that will be generated from being in a close proximity to an educational institution?
So at this point in our conversation so far, the task force has not excluded any district that is currently zoned commercial. So at this point, everything is on the table, except I think we thought that some of the side streets off Witherspoon North that may have some small restaurants on them are too residential probably to be appropriate. So including Witherspoon. And Michelle, did I say that?
Yeah, you got it.
Right. So at this point, I know, so at this point, everything is on the table. We have the public meeting tonight. We have another public meeting, and I want to announce that we're also having a meeting with the Witherspoon Jackson Neighborhood Association. And that will be at 10 a.m. on, I think, September 25th, and it's going to be at the Arts Council. 10 a.m. September 25th. There's another item on the agenda, which is the Witherspoon Street development, and I'm not sure which is first, but I can find out. So anyone who's interested in that, it will be a mandatory mask since it's an in-person meeting. But that will be an opportunity to, engage the neighborhood. We've been trying to work on that for the last few months, and it's been hard to pin down a date. So I'm really glad that we're going to do that. Did that answer your question, John? And Michelle, did you want to add something?
Bernadette's been very
Yes,
patient.
and then I was going to say Bernadette, and then I have just a couple of brief announcements, and then I'll wrap it up. Sorry about that, Bernadette. Please go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to say kudos to Reverend Dr. Boyer, Mr. Bailey, and Udi for bringing up this very important information to us today. I was getting a little concerned because I think that was not being addressed. We've had so many meetings, and I kept waiting for someone to give us the scoop on what we can do to make equity a reality in Princeton, and not just lip service. And when Mr. Bailey used that word lip service, I thought that was a mic drop moment for me, because that seems to be a lot of what happens around equity and justice in a lot of other situations. And I do not want the cannabis to be one of those things. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I know it's been very frustrating for some people, including some who haven't been here today. Our representative from Not in Our Town and from the Civil Rights Commission, who have consistently brought up the, when are we going to talk about? And again, because of our drive to meet the deadline, the opt-in deadline, a lot of other things that we thought would get addressed earlier in the process got postponed, but we'll be turning to them more frequently going on. So let me just make a couple of brief announcements. And I was going to say something about John Bailey's meeting tomorrow, but I think that was already addressed. The next meeting of the task force will be on October 7th at 1:30. And we have a public meeting tonight at 7 by Zoom. You should have all the task force members should have gotten invites to come on as panelists. The last one was a little unfortunate with the Zoom bombing. So we're trying to put some structures in place that don't involve me learning how to use Zoom functions that I don't know how to use in a very brief period of time. And then we have a second meeting on the 18th. And Leticia, are we a go for Heinz Plaza for that? Or are we still working?
Yes, we are. And the library has confirmed that we can use their PA system.
Excellent. And will they also supply tables, chairs, et cetera? We'll talk about that.
Yes, okay. I'm certain they will.
Excellent. So we do have a Zoom link, and that will be our backup in case of inclement weather. And otherwise, we'll have that meeting on the 18th at 10 a.m. on Heinz Plaza. And, I invite all of you to come to our meeting tonight, and just a tremendous thanks to Udi, to Reverend Boyer, to John Bailey for joining us here today. It really has been tremendous. Thank you so much. And Udi, I know you put, and Reverend Boyer also, a lot of thought and work into this, and we really appreciate it. We're in debt to you.
Thank you so much. This was a great conversation.
Thanks. And
thank you to Reverend Dr. Boyer in particular for making the time for this.
Thank you all. It's been a privilege to be with you all.
Thank you. I hope we may reserve the right to call on you again at a later
Absolutely.
point. And I apologize again that the recording will have missed your opening. And next time somebody, not that it's anyone else's job, but somebody poke me earlier to remember to press record. So, all right. I hope to see many of you tonight at our public meeting at 7. So thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.